The first time people mentioned the name Eleanor Whitmore in hushed voices, it wasn't because of her wealth. It was because of what she could do with it. In the upper circles of the city, Eleanor Whitmore was not simply respected. She was feared in a quiet, calculating way that made powerful men choose their words carefully. She had built an empire from nothing: logistics, energy, technology. 3 industries that bent to her will over 4 decades of relentless discipline. Her companies employed tens of thousands. Her influence reached into boardrooms, governments, and private investment circles across continents. But the most fascinating thing about Eleanor Whitmore was not her power, it was her control. Control over her companies, control over her reputation, control over every person who carried the Whitmore name. And there was only one person in the world who could truly challenge that control: her son, Alexander Whitmore. He was the heir to everything she had built. Tall, composed, and impossibly calm in situations that made other executives sweat, Alexander had grown up watching his mother dismantle billion-dollar rivals with the same calm precision someone might use to solve a puzzle. But unlike Eleanor, Alexander had something she never quite understood: a quiet sense of mercy. It made him respected. It also made her uneasy. Because mercy, in Eleanor's world, was a weakness. For years, society magazines speculated endlessly about who Alexander Whitmore would eventually marry: a daughter of a political dynasty, a brilliant tech founder, a European aristocrat. Some are known powerful, some are known strategic, some are known who would strengthen the Whitmore empire instead. One autumn morning, a single photograph appeared online. Alexander Whitmore standing outside a modest courthouse. Beside him stood a woman no one recognized. No press conference, no engagement announcement. Just a simple document confirming that Alexander Whitmore had married a woman named Iris Caldwell. Within hours, the city's elite began whispering. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why had the most eligible billionaire in the country married someone completely unknown? But the person who reacted the most quietly was Eleanor Whitmore. She simply looked at the photograph for a long time. The woman beside her son wore a plain cream-colored dress. Her hair was dark and loosely tied back. Her expression was calm, no nervous, no triumphant, just calm, which made Eleanor narrow her eyes slightly, because calm people were either harmless or very dangerous, and Eleanor Whitmore never assumed the first option. 3 days later, she made a decision. She would meet her son's wife, but not in private. If this woman intended to enter the Whitmore family, she would do it under the same scrutiny everyone else endured. So Eleanor sent invitations, dozens of them, to relatives, to longtime family friends, to executives, to influential social figures who had spent years observing the Whitmore dynasty. But the people receiving the invitations understood something else entirely. It was not a celebration, it was an examination, and the woman named Iris Caldwell would be the subject. Across the city, the Whitmore estate stood like a monument to legacy. It was not merely a mansion. It was a sprawling property surrounded by ancient trees and quiet gardens that had been carefully maintained for generations. Tall windows reflected the evening sky. Stone walls held decades of family history. Inside, chandeliers cast warm light across marble floors. Servants moved through hallways with quiet efficiency as preparations began. In the main dining room, a long table was arranged with flawless precision: crystal glasses, silver cutlery, plates imported from Europe, every detail chosen carefully, because Eleanor Whitmore believed something important. If you controlled the environment, you controlled the conversation. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the first cars began arriving. Guests stepped out into the cool evening air. Men in tailored suits, women in elegant gowns. Their voices carried polite curiosity, but beneath the surface of every conversation was the same unspoken question: what kind of woman marries Alexander Whitmore without warning the world first? Inside the estate, Eleanor Whitmore stood near the tall windows of the main hall. She wore a deep midnight blue gown, minimal jewelry, perfect posture. Her silver-streaked hair was styled flawlessly. She looked less like a hostess and more like a monarch awaiting a court audience. One by one, guests greeted her, polite smiles, measured compliments. But every one of them eventually asked the same thing. "Have you met your daughter-in-law yet?" Eleanor's response never changed. "No, yet, but we will tonight." And the way she said it made several people exchange quiet glances, because they all knew Eleanor Whitmore well enough to understand something. She was not curious, she was evaluating. Nearly an hour passed, the house filled with quiet conversation and the soft sound of glasses touching. And then, outside the tall front doors, headlights appeared along the driveway. A black car rolled to a slow stop. Inside the hall, several guests turned instinctively, because they knew Alexander Whitmore had arrived. The front doors opened. Alexander stepped inside first. He wore a simple dark suit that somehow made him look even more composed than usual. His presence had a strange effect on rooms. No, loud, no, dramatic, but steady, like gravity had quietly shifted. And then, beside him, Iris Caldwell stepped into the light. The room grew noticeably quieter. No because of extravagance, but because of the opposite. She wore a soft grey dress that fell elegantly to the floor. No elaborate jewelry, no designer theatrics. Her hair rested naturally over her shoulders. But what struck people most was her expression. She looked comfortable, as if entering one of the most powerful households in the city was no different than walking into a library. Several guests leaned slightly toward one another. Whispers began. Eleanor Whitmore watched from across the hall. Her eyes studied the woman carefully. Posture, movement, confidence. Nothing escaped her attention. Alexander guided Iris forward. Their footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor. The crowd parted just enough to create a clear path. At the center of the hall, Alexander stopped. Eleanor Whitmore stood waiting. For a brief moment, mother and son simply looked at each other. Then Alexander spoke, "Mother." And then her gaze shifted to Iris. "This is the woman who changed my son's plans without informing the rest of us." Her tone was calm, but sharp. Iris met her eyes without hesitation. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore." Her voice was gentle, steady, which made Eleanor's eyebrow lift slightly. Interesting. Most people showed nerves within seconds of standing in front of her, but Iris Caldwell seemed entirely unbothered. Eleanor stepped closer. She examined the young woman with the quiet focus of someone studying a puzzle. "Tell me something," she said calmly. "Did my son explain what kind of family he belongs to?" A subtle tension moved through the nearby guests. Alexander's jaw shifted slightly. But Iris answered first. "He told me his family values, discipline, loyalty, and legacy." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, accurate, but incomplete. She leaned slightly closer. "This family also values strength. People who marry into it are expected to contribute something meaningful." Her gaze sharpened. "What exactly do you contribute, Iris Caldwell?" The room waited. Several guests leaned forward almost imperceptibly, because the question had been asked deliberately. It was not curiosity, it was a test, but Iris did not rush her answer. Instead, she looked around the hall briefly. Her eyes moved across the gathered faces. Then she returned her gaze to Eleanor. "Perspective," she said softly. A faint ripple of confusion passed through the room. Eleanor tilted her head. "Perspective." Iris nodded. "When people spend too long surrounded by power, they sometimes forget how the world outside it actually works." The room became very still. Eleanor watched her carefully. That sounded dangerously close to criticism, and yet the woman had spoken it with complete politeness. Alexander's lips almost curved into a smile, because he knew something most people in the room didn't yet realize. Iris Caldwell was not nervous, no, even slightly. But Eleanor Whitmore was far from finished. Her gaze remained sharp. "You're implying my family lacks perspective." Iris shook her head gently. "No, I'm saying perspective is easier to maintain when different kinds of people are allowed into the room." A faint murmur passed through several guests. Eleanor studied her for another long moment. Then something unexpected happened. She smiled. No, warmly, but with interest. "Very well," she said. "Let's see how well your perspective holds up tonight." She turned toward the dining room. "Dinner is ready." And that was when the first real tension of the evening began to rise, because everyone in the room understood something important. This dinner would determine whether Iris Caldwell was accepted or quietly dismantled. But what none of them knew yet was that before the night ended, someone at that table would reveal a secret that could change the future of the Whitmore empire forever. And the person holding that secret was the quiet woman everyone had just underestimated. The dining room of the Whitmore estate had witnessed decades of power struggles that never made it into newspapers. Deals had been whispered across that table. Rivals had been invited as guests and quietly left as defeated partners. Careers had been built and dismantled beneath the soft glow of its chandeliers. And tonight, the long, polished table was waiting for something else, a test. Servants moved silently as guests began taking their seats. Each chair had been arranged with careful intention. Eleanor Whitmore sat at the head of the table, where the entire room naturally faced her. Alexander sat to her right, and directly across from Eleanor, placed with deliberate precision, sat Iris Caldwell, the quiet new wife, the woman everyone had come to examine. Crystal glasses reflected the warm light overhead. Silver utensils rested perfectly beside white porcelain plates. The atmosphere felt calm, but underneath that calm was something sharper. Expectation. The first course was served, a delicate dish prepared by a chef who had worked in Michelin-starred kitchens before being recruited to the Whitmore estate. But almost no one paid attention to the food. Eyes drifted repeatedly toward Iris. They studied how she held her glass, how she spoke, how she responded to the subtle pressures of the room. And Eleanor Whitmore noticed everything. She noticed the way Iris thanked the staff quietly when they served her plate. She noticed how she listened more than she spoke. She noticed the absence of nervous fidgeting, and slowly Eleanor began to feel something unfamiliar, curiosity. Across the table, Iris seemed perfectly at ease. No dominating the conversation. No shrinking from it either, just observing. Alexander spoke occasionally with relatives, but every now and then his gaze shifted toward Iris. No, protective, no, worried, simply confident. Which made Eleanor wonder something she hadn't considered before. Why was her son so certain this woman could survive this room? The second course arrived, and that was when Eleanor decided the evening had waited long enough. She placed her fork gently on the table. The quiet sound was enough to bring conversations to a pause. Then she looked directly at Iris. "Tell me something," she said calmly. The room's attention immediately returned to the center of the table. Iris met her gaze. "Yes," Eleanor leaned back slightly. "Your husband grew up surrounded by people who understood ambition, power, responsibility." Her eyes sharpened just a fraction. "But you lived a very different life before meeting him, didn't you?" Several guests exchanged subtle looks. The tone of the question was polite, but its meaning was clear. "Explain yourself." Iris nodded slowly. "Yes, I did." Eleanor folded her hands. "Then perhaps you can help us understand something." Her voice was smooth, controlled. "What exactly made you believe you belonged beside my son?" A few relatives looked down at their plates. Others watched with open interest, because Eleanor Whitmore had just asked the question everyone had been quietly thinking. Iris did not answer immediately. Instead, she took a small sip of water. Then she placed the glass down carefully. "I didn't believe I belonged beside him," she said softly. The answer surprised several people. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "No," Iris shook her head gently. "I believed we belonged beside each other." A subtle shift passed through the room. It was a small difference in wording, but the meaning carried weight. Eleanor's gaze remained steady. "And what convinced you of that?" Iris glanced briefly toward Alexander, then back to Eleanor. "Because the first time we spoke, he didn't ask about my connections or my background. He asked what I was working on, and when I told him, he listened." Alexander smiled faintly at the memory. One of Eleanor's cousins leaned forward. "What were you working on?" Iris turned toward him. "Restoring a coastal research library that was about to close." The man frowned slightly. "A library, yes. The building holds rare climate records. dating back over 200 years. Several scientists rely on those archives to track environmental patterns. Without preservation, that data disappears. Silence lingered for a moment. Then a few polite nods appeared around the table, interesting, but hardly impressive by Whitmore standards. Eleanor noticed the reaction, and she pressed further. That sounds admirable, but surely you understand something. Her voice remained calm. This family doesn't operate on admirable intentions. We operate on results. Iris looked thoughtful, then she nodded. Yes, I understand that. Eleanor gestured lightly with her hand. Then perhaps you can tell us what results you've achieved. A deliberate challenge, one that implied something simple. Your work sounds sentimental. But what has it actually accomplished? The room grew quiet again. Some guests expected Iris to struggle here, but instead she gave a small, thoughtful nod. That's a fair question. She paused, then continued. The project I mentioned secured environmental records that helped 3 coastal cities redesign their flood prevention systems. A few people blinked. Iris continued calmly. Those systems protected nearly 2 million residents during last year's storms. A quiet ripple moved through the table. One of Alexander's uncles frowned. Are you saying your research influenced government infrastructure decisions? Iris nodded. Yes, the room shifted slightly. Because suddenly the conversation felt different. Eleanor studied her carefully. You're claiming a library archive changed public policy. Iris shook her head gently. No, I'm saying knowledge did, and knowledge only exists when someone protects it. For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then she leaned back again, interesting. But still, her eyes narrowed slightly. It doesn't explain why my son married you in secret. And there it was. The question beneath every other question. Why had Alexander Whitmore married this woman without consulting anyone? All eyes turned toward him, but Alexander simply lifted his glass calmly, because it wasn't anyone else's decision. Eleanor's gaze hardened slightly. Families consult each other before making life-altering choices. Alexander met her eyes. Families support each other after they're Maid. A quiet tension settled over the table. Mother and son rarely disagreed in public, but tonight was beginning to feel different. And then something unexpected happened. One of the younger cousins leaned toward Iris with curiosity. Can I ask something? Iris nodded. Of course. The young woman hesitated slightly. Are you intimidated by all this? She gestured around the grand dining room. The wealth, the expectations, the reputation, everyone listened, because it was a question many of them secretly wondered. Iris looked around the room slowly, then she smiled gently. No. A few people blinked. No. Iris shook her head. No, really, why not? Iris folded her hands lightly. Because powerful families often believe their greatest strength is money or influence, but real strength usually comes from something else. Several guests leaned forward slightly. Eleanor watched her carefully. And what is that? Iris met her gaze again. The ability to listen when someone tells you the truth. Silence followed. Then Eleanor gave a soft laugh, a dangerous laugh. Truth is rarely simple. Iris nodded. That's true. Eleanor's eyes sharpened again. Then perhaps you can share a truth with us tonight. Her voice lowered slightly. Something about yourself that no one here knows yet. The room waited, because Eleanor Whitmore had just placed Iris directly in the spotlight, and everyone expected something modest, something ordinary. But Iris simply looked around the table. Then she spoke quietly. There is something you don't know. Alexander watched her carefully now, because he realized what she was about to say, and the moment her next sentence left her lips, the entire dinner would change. Several guests leaned closer, waiting, and Iris Caldwell said calmly, Before I met Alexander, I spent 2 years investigating one of the largest corporate cover-ups in modern history. The room froze. Forks paused in mid-air. Eyes widened. Even Eleanor Whitmore felt a flicker of surprise, because she knew something important. There were very few corporate scandals large enough to be described that way, and most of them involved powerful people, very powerful people. Eleanor's voice lowered slightly. What kind of investigation? Iris looked directly at her. The kind that exposes companies that hide dangerous environmental damage. A ripple of tension passed through the room. One of the Whitmore executives shifted in his chair. Alexander watched his mother carefully, because he knew exactly what Iris was doing. She wasn't defending herself. She was slowly turning the spotlight, and before the night ended, some inane at this table might realize that the quiet woman they had invited to examine had actually come here to examine them, and that realization was about to make the rest of the evening far more dangerous than anyone expected. For a moment after Iris finished speaking, the dining room felt unnaturally quiet. No, the comfortable silence of a formal dinner. Something heavier, something watchful. Several guests shifted in their chairs, exchanging glances that carried more questions than answers, because the words Iris had chosen were not accidental. Corporate cover-up, environmental damage, investigations. Those were not topics that usually appeared at elegant family dinners. Eleanor Whitmore rested her fingertips lightly against the table. Her posture had not changed. Her expression remained composed. But inside her mind, something had sharpened. She studied Iris again carefully, and Eleanor Whitmore respected strategy, even when she didn't yet understand it. Across the table, Iris sat with the same steady posture she had carried since entering the house. No smugness, no triumph, just quiet certainty. Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair, watching, waiting. One of Eleanor's longtime business associates cleared his throat softly. His name was Victor Holden, a man who had built several shipping companies that frequently partnered with the Whitmore logistics networks. His voice carried cautious curiosity. "You said you investigated a corporate cover-up." Iris nodded. "Yes." Victor frowned slightly. "That kind of investigation usually requires legal backing, financial support, political risk." He paused. "How exactly did you manage something like that?" Iris turned toward him calmly. "I didn't do it alone." Victor waited, but Iris did not elaborate further. The pause stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice calm, measured. "You must understand why people here are curious." She gestured lightly toward the guests. "Our industries intersect with many sensitive areas: energy, transport, infrastructure." Her gaze sharpened slightly. "So when someone mentions corporate misconduct in a room full of executives, it tends to attract attention." Iris nodded. "Of course." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "And which company were you investigating?" That question landed like a small stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread immediately. Several guests leaned forward. Others suddenly became interested in their wine glasses, because if Iris named a company connected to someone in the room, the atmosphere would change very quickly. But Iris simply smiled softly. "I signed confidentiality agreements. I can't reveal the company's name." A quiet breath passed through the room. Some people relaxed, others grew even more curious. Victor Holden raised an eyebrow. "Then, how did the investigation end?" Iris answered calmly, "With a settlement that forced the company to fund long-term environmental restoration." Eleanor watched her carefully. "How large was the settlement?" Iris hesitated for half a second, long enough to make people wonder whether she intended to answer at all. Then she said quietly, "Just over $2 billion. The reaction around the table was immediate. $2 billion. That was not a minor corporate dispute. That was a catastrophe. Victor sat back slowly. "That kind of settlement usually destroys a company's reputation." Iris nodded. "It nearly did." Eleanor leaned forward slightly now, interest replacing skepticism. "What prevented it?" Iris's eyes flickered briefly across the table. "Then," she answered, "the company admitted fault early enough to avoid a prolonged legal battle. They funded cleanup operations. They compensated affected communities, and they replaced their entire executive board." A few quiet whistles sounded from one end of the table. That was not simply damage control. That was corporate surgery. Eleanor studied her more carefully than ever now, because one detail had begun to bother her. Most investigators who handled scandals that large became well known in business media. But she had never heard Iris Caldwell's name before, which meant one of two things: either Iris was exaggerating, or she had intentionally remained invisible. And people who stayed invisible after major victories were often far more dangerous than those who sought attention. Across the table, one of Alexander's younger cousins leaned forward. So after something that big, why go back to restoring libraries? A few people nodded. Yes, that question made sense. If Iris had the skills to dismantle corporations, why step away from that kind of influence? Iris considered the question. Then she answered softly, because once the investigation ended, I realized something important. The room waited. Iris continued. People only care about disasters after they happen. Her voice was gentle, but the meaning settled heavily in the room. Most companies wait until damage is proven before they change their behavior. She glanced briefly at Eleanor, but prevention requires something else entirely. Eleanor's gaze sharpened. What? Iris met her eyes. Conscience. No one spoke, because in a room filled with executives who managed billions of dollars, that word carried unusual weight. Eleanor tapped her finger lightly against the table. An almost invisible motion, but Alexander noticed it. It was something she did when she was thinking deeply. You believe corporations lack conscience? Eleanor asked. Iris shook her head slowly. No, I believe corporations reflect the conscience of the people leading them. A faint shift moved through the guests. That statement could be interpreted in many ways, some flattering, some very uncomfortable. Eleanor held her gaze. Then she asked a quieter question. And what do you believe about the Whitmore companies? No. The room became truly still, because that question had been sharpened like a blade. Answer carefully, or not at all. Iris didn't rush. She studied Eleanor's face with calm attention. Then she said something that surprised everyone. I haven't formed an opinion yet. A few eyebrows lifted. Eleanor leaned slightly closer. No opinion. Iris shook her head. No, without evidence. Victor Holden chuckled quietly. You investigate your own family's companies. Iris smiled, faintly. Everyone should understand the systems they're connected to. Victor laughed again. Practical, but dangerous. Eleanor said nothing. She simply watched Iris because something about that answer intrigued her. It wasn't defensive, it wasn't flattering, it was honest. And honesty inside rooms like this was rare. The third course arrived. Servants moved carefully between chairs. Plates were replaced, wine glasses refilled, but the conversation had shifted permanently. No one saw Iris Caldwell as an ordinary outsider anymore. She had introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty made powerful people uneasy. Alexander leaned toward Iris slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Iris glanced toward him with a faint smile. A little. He shook his head softly. My mother hasn't been this curious about someone in years. Iris whispered back. Curiosity is better than hostility. Alexander looked toward Eleanor. Don't be too sure about that. At the head of the table, Eleanor Whitmore lifted her glass slowly. She spoke just loudly enough to regain the room's attention. I must admit something. Everyone looked toward her. When I first heard my son had married someone without informing the family, her eyes shifted briefly toward Iris. I assumed the explanation would be disappointing. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, but Eleanor continued. However, her voice softened just slightly. You are proving to be more interesting than I expected. Iris inclined her head politely. Thank you. But Eleanor was not finished. She leaned forward again, and yet her tone cooled. There is still one detail I find strange. The room waited. Eleanor's gaze locked onto Iris. Investigators who expose billion-dollar scandals rarely disappear quietly afterward. They write books, give interviews, build consulting firms. Her eyebrow lifted. But you did none of that. Iris nodded. That's correct. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. Why? And there it was. The real question Eleanor had been circling since the beginning of dinner. Why had a woman capable of dismantling a massive corporation suddenly stepped away from public influence? Iris folded her hands lightly in her lap. Then she answered with quiet honesty. Because the investigation wasn't the most important part, Eleanor frowned slightly no. Iris shook her head. The aftermath was. Victor Holden leaned forward again, meaning. Iris's voice grew softer. During the investigation I spent months visiting communities affected by the damage, fishing towns, small coastal villages, families whose homes had been quietly poisoned by pollution they didn't even know existed yet. Silence filled the room again, and that was when Iris said something that made several executives shift in their chairs. The company we investigated had known about the problem for nearly 12 years, before anyone spoke publicly about it. Eleanor's expression did not change, but inside her mind another small piece of curiosity sharpened. 12 years was a long time. Too long, Victor asked quietly. What kind of damage were we talking about? Iris answered simply, toxic runoff entering groundwater. A faint murmur moved through the guests. That kind of contamination could take decades to repair, and the legal consequences could cripple entire industries. Eleanor's voice remained steady, and you exposed it. Iris nodded. Yes. Another long pause followed. Then Eleanor asked the question no one else had dared to voice. Did anyone in this room have connections to that company? The air in the dining room seemed to tighten instantly, because if the answer was yes, the evening was about to become something far more serious than a family dinner. Iris looked slowly around the table. Her gaze moved from face to face, studying, measuring, and for a brief moment, someone near the far end of the table lowered their eyes, just for a second. But Eleanor Whitmore noticed everything. She saw the flicker of discomfort, the hesitation, the sudden silence, and for the first time that evening, she realized something surprising. This dinner was no longer about testing her son's wife. It had become something else entirely. Something far more complicated, because Iris Caldwell might not be the only person in this room with secrets. And before the night ended, one of those secrets might be forced into the light. The moment Eleanor Whitmore asked whether anyone at the table had connections to the company Iris investigated, the air in the dining room changed, no dramatically, no visibly enough for an outsider to notice, but the kind of shift that people accustomed to power could feel immediately, the quiet tightening of shoulders, the sudden interest in wine glasses, the subtle way people avoided direct eye contact. Eleanor had spent 40 years reading rooms like this. She could sense fear the way a sailor senses a storm long before clouds appear. And someone at this table had just felt a tremor. Iris, however, did not answer the question immediately. She continued looking around the room, her gaze moving calmly across each guest. It was not confrontational, no accusing, just observant, which somehow made it more unsettling. Victor Holden leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his arms. That's quite a pause, he said lightly. Iris finally looked toward him again. I'm thinking about how to answer carefully. Victor smiled faintly. Carefully usually means yes. A few quiet chuckles drifted across the table. But Eleanor did not laugh. Her attention had locked onto someone sitting 3 seats to her left, Gregory Whitmore, her younger brother. Gregory had never possessed Eleanor's ruthless discipline, but he had always enjoyed the privileges of the Whitmore name: luxury homes, private investments, corporate advisory positions that required very little actual work. And right now, Gregory Whitmore looked uncomfortable. He was staring down at his plate. No eating, no speaking, just quietly still. Eleanor's voice broke the silence. Gregory, the name landed like a small hammer. Slowly Gregory looked up. Yes, Eleanor tilted her head slightly. You've been unusually quiet this evening. Gregory forced a small smile. Just listening. Eleanor's eyes held his. Then perhaps you have a thought about our guest's investigation. The room turned toward him. Gregory shifted in his chair. Corporate scandals happen all the time, he said carefully. Hardly unusual. Iris watched him quietly. Victor Holden raised an eyebrow. $2 billion settlements are fairly unusual. Gregory shrugged slightly. Depends on the industry. Eleanor studied her brother, because something about his tone felt defensive, and Gregory Whitmore was not a man who usually cared enough to defend anything. Across the table, Iris spoke softly. The company in question operated several chemical processing facilities along the eastern coastline. Gregory's fork slipped from his fingers. The small metallic sound echoed across the table. Everyone turned. Gregory cleared his throat quickly. "Clumsy tonight," he muttered. But Eleanor's eyes had already sharpened, because she remembered something years ago. Gregory had convinced the family to invest in a small chemical logistics firm, a company called North Bay Transport. It had seemed harmless at the time, minor infrastructure contracts, nothing major, but now a thought quietly formed in Eleanor's mind, and she did not like it. Victor spoke again. "Chemical processing runoff is a nightmare to clean up." Iris nodded. "Yes, especially when the waste disposal systems are intentionally misreported." That statement made two executives at the table exchange uncomfortable glances. Gregory reached for his wine glass. His hand was slightly unsteady. Alexander noticed it, so did Iris, but Iris said nothing instead. She asked a simple question. "Mr. Whitmore," Gregory looked up sharply. "Yes, you've worked with logistics companies before, haven't you?" Gregory nodded cautiously. "Some advisory work. Why?" Iris tilted her head thoughtfully. "Did you ever hear of a firm called North Bay Transport?" Gregory froze. Only for a moment, but long enough for Eleanor to see it. And when Eleanor Whitmore saw weakness, she never ignored it. Gregory forced a laugh. "Small company. Lots of firms like that." Iris held his gaze. "North Bay managed hazardous waste transportation for the company we investigated." The room went completely still. Victor Holden straightened slowly. "That's unfortunate," Gregory swallowed. "Coincidences happen." Eleanor's voice cut through the room like glass. "Gregory," her brother turned toward her. "Did the Whitmore family invest in North Bay Transport?" Gregory hesitated, only briefly, but the silence answered the question before he spoke. "Yes." A quiet murmur passed around the table. Because if the Whitmore family had financial ties to a company connected to a $2 billion environmental scandal, the implications were serious. Very serious. Eleanor's voice remained calm. "How large was the investment?" Gregory wiped his mouth with a napkin. "Small, very small." Eleanor's eyes hardened. "Numbers?" Gregory hesitated again, then muttered, 15%. Victor let out a low whistle. "That's not small." Eleanor leaned back slowly in her chair. Her mind was already moving through possibilities. 15% ownership meant influence. It meant board visibility and potentially liability. But Iris spoke before Eleanor could continue. North Bay Transport was not charged with wrongdoing. Gregory looked up quickly, relief flashing across his face. "See," Iris continued calmly. "However," Victor sighed softly. "There's always a however." Iris nodded. "However, North Bay executives were aware that the waste shipments they handled were being misclassified." The relief vanished from Gregory's face. Eleanor's gaze shifted slowly toward him. Gregory, her voice had grown very quiet. "Did you know about that?" Gregory's mouth closed, then opened again. "Of course not." Eleanor watched him, and in that moment she knew he was lying. No necessarily about the details, but about something, and Eleanor Whitmore had never tolerated lies inside her family. Alexander leaned forward slightly. "Mother," Eleanor raised a hand gently. He stopped, because he understood that gesture. It meant she was thinking, and interrupting her thinking was dangerous. The tension in the room had grown almost unbearable. A family dinner had just turned into a corporate interrogation, and everyone at the table knew it. Then Iris spoke again, her voice calm. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm not accusing you of anything." Gregory looked grateful for the lifeline. "Good, because this sounds like an accusation." Iris shook her head slightly. "No, it's context." Gregory frowned. "Context for what?" Iris looked down at her plate for a moment. Then she said something that made the entire room lean forward again. "Because North Bay Transport wasn't the company responsible for the contamination." The silence returned instantly. Victor frowned. "Then why bring them up?" Iris looked directly at Eleanor. "Because they helped someone hide it." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Iris's gaze remained steady. That's what I'm still trying to find out. Another wave of tension rolled through the dining room. Gregory looked pale now. Alexander watched Iris carefully, and for the first time that evening, Eleanor Whitmore realized something she had not considered before. This dinner had not simply been an introduction. It had been a stage, and Iris Caldwell had walked onto it with a purpose. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice lower now. "Tell me something, Iris." Iris met her gaze. "Yes, when you accepted my invitation to dinner tonight." Her eyes sharpened. "Did you already know Gregory had invested in North Bay Transport?" The question landed with surgical precision. Iris did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked slowly around the table again. Then she returned her gaze to Eleanor. "Yes," several guests gasped quietly. Gregory slammed his palm lightly against the table. "Then why come here?" Iris's expression remained calm. "Because I wanted to meet the people connected to the Whitmore empire." Victor stared at her. "You're still investigating?" Iris nodded slowly. "Yes." Gregory's voice rose. "You can't investigate this family." Alexander spoke calmly. "Watch your tone." Gregory glared at him. "Your wife is accusing us of criminal behavior." Iris shook her head gently. "No, I'm asking question." Eleanor leaned back again. Her eyes had grown very thoughtful now, because suddenly something had become very clear. This quiet young woman, the one everyone assumed would be intimidated tonight, had walked into the Whitmore estate already holding pieces of a puzzle, and those pieces were beginning to connect in ways that could shake the entire family. But the most unsettling realization of all was that Iris Caldwell might already know more about the Whitmore empire than anyone at this table realized, and if that was true, then the real danger tonight was not what she had already revealed. It was what she hadn't said yet. Because somewhere in her investigation, Iris Caldwell had discovered something powerful enough to make her walk straight into the most intimidating household in the city and start asking questions. And whatever that secret was, Eleanor Whitmore had a growing suspicion. It was connected to someone far more important than Gregory. Dinner ended, but no one in the Whitmore estate believed the evening was truly over. The last plates were cleared. Dessert had been served and politely tasted. Conversations resumed around the table, but they carried a strained politeness now, like musicians trying to continue playing after someone had snapped a violin string. Gregory Whitmore barely spoke another word. Victor Holden and two other executives had shifted the discussion to shipping contracts and global markets, pretending the earlier tension had simply been an intellectual debate. But the illusion fooled no one. Eleanor Whitmore sat silently at the head of the table, listening to everything and nothing at once. Her mind was moving through the conversation piece by piece. North Bay Transport, chemical waste shipments, misclassified cargo, $2 billion settlements, and now her own brother's quiet panic. But something else bothered her even more. Iris Caldwell had known about Gregory's investment before she walked into the house, which meant she had researched the Whitmore family thoroughly, carefully. The question was, why? No curiosity, no caution. There had been purpose in the way she introduced that information, almost like someone placing a chess piece on a board, testing reactions. And Eleanor Whitmore had spent most of her life defeating people who played games like that, which meant she needed to understand exactly what game Iris Caldwell believed she was playing. Across the table, Alexander leaned slightly toward his wife. His voice was quiet. "You've officially terrified half the people here." Iris smiled faintly. "That wasn't my intention." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" Iris glanced toward Gregory at the far end of the table. He looked as though he had swallowed a stone. "Fear usually reveals things faster than politeness," she said softly. Alexander studied her. "You already knew he'd react that way." Iris did not answer, which was answer enough. At the head of the table, Eleanor placed her napkin beside her plate, a small motion, but one that immediately caught the attention of everyone present. "Dinner," she said calmly, "is finished." Chairs shifted as guests began rising. Servants moved in quietly, but before anyone could disperse fully, Eleanor added something else. Iris, the room paused again. Iris looked toward her. Yes, Eleanor stood. Would you walk with me for a moment? The invitation sounded polite, but no one in the Whitmore family misunderstood it. This was not a walk. It was a private conversation, possibly an interrogation. Alexander started to rise from his chair, but Eleanor looked at him alone. The word was soft but final. Alexander held his mother's gaze for a moment. Then he sat back slowly. Iris stood from her chair. Of course, several guests watched quietly as Eleanor turned toward the tall glass doors leading into the estate's garden terrace. The night air outside was cool and still. Lantern lights lined the stone paths that curved through the carefully maintained gardens. Eleanor stepped outside first. Iris followed. Behind them, the doors closed softly. The sound of conversation inside the house faded into distant murmurs. For a moment neither woman spoke. They walked slowly along the stone path, beneath tall trees that rustled gently in the evening breeze. Finally Eleanor stopped near a fountain. Water flowed softly over smooth marble. She turned toward Iris. You came here tonight with information about my family. It was not a question. Iris nodded. Yes, Eleanor's eyes were sharp now. Most people who challenge the Whitmore family do it publicly. Lawyers, competitors, regulators. Her voice lowered slightly. But you chose a private dinner. Why? Iris looked out across the dark garden. Because public accusations make people defensive. Eleanor folded her arms, and private ones. Iris met her gaze. They make people honest. Eleanor studied her for several seconds. You're assuming honesty is what I want. Iris shook her head gently. No, I'm assuming you want the truth. A faint smile touched Eleanor's lips. Careful answer. Then she stepped closer. Let's stop circling each other. Her voice grew colder. You knew Gregory had invested in North Bay Transport. You knew the company handled hazardous waste shipments. And you knew there was a connection to the environmental case you investigated. Her eyes narrowed. So tell me something directly. Are you here because you believe the Whitmore family is responsible for that contamination? The garden seemed to grow quieter. Iris considered the question carefully. Then she answered. No, Eleanor watched her closely. No, Iris shook her head. I believe someone used companies connected to your family. Eleanor's expression did not change. But her thoughts sharpened. Used them how? Iris gestured lightly toward the house. Large corporate networks are complicated. Investments overlap. Subsidiaries share logistics partners. Sometimes companies transport materials without understanding exactly what they're carrying. Eleanor nodded slowly. And you believe that happened here? Iris hesitated. Possibly. Eleanor stepped closer. Then, why come to dinner? You could have contacted regulators, investigators, law firms. Iris's voice softened. Because I'm not trying to destroy your family. The words hung quietly between them. Eleanor searched her face. And what are you trying to do? Iris answered, simply prevent something worse. A long silence followed. Then Eleanor said something very quiet. The contamination case you investigated ended 2 years ago. Iris nodded. Yes, Eleanor's voice dropped even further. So why are you still investigating it? Iris looked toward the fountain again, because the company that paid the settlement wasn't the one that caused the damage. For the first time that evening, Eleanor Whitmore felt something close to genuine surprise. Explain. Iris turned back toward her. The company we exposed was dumping toxic runoff, but they weren't producing the chemicals responsible for the contamination. Eleanor frowned slightly. Then who was? Iris met her eyes. That's the question I've been trying to answer. Eleanor's mind moved quickly now. If the settlement had forced the wrong company to take responsibility, then someone else had escaped entirely. Someone powerful enough to remain hidden even during a massive investigation. And powerful people left trails, if you knew where to look. Eleanor's voice grew quiet. Why involve my family? Iris answered calmly. Because one of the hidden suppliers used North Bay Transport to move their waste shipments. Eleanor's gaze sharpened again. Gregory's company. Iris nodded indirectly. Another long silence followed. Then Eleanor asked something she had not expected herself to say. Do you have proof? Iris shook her head slowly. No, yet Eleanor studied her carefully. Then why tell me any of this? Iris took a slow breath. Because if the supplier responsible for that contamination is still operating. Her voice softened slightly. Then more communities will eventually suffer the same damage. Eleanor watched her for a long moment. Then she asked the question that mattered most. And what makes you believe the Whitmore family would help you expose them? Iris did not hesitate. Because Alexander Whitmore wouldn't marry someone who ignored the truth. The fountain continued its soft rhythm beside them. Eleanor considered that answer carefully. Then she said something almost thoughtful. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless. Iris smiled slightly, possibly both. Eleanor looked back toward the glowing windows of the house. Inside, her guests were laughing again, pretending the tension of dinner had faded. But Eleanor knew better. Secrets had already begun to surface, and secrets, once disturbed, rarely returned quietly to the shadows. She turned back toward Iris. Tell me something honestly. Iris waited. Did you marry my son because of this investigation? The question carried more weight than anything Eleanor had asked all evening. Iris met her gaze calmly. No. Eleanor searched her face for any sign of hesitation. There was none. Then she asked a second question. Does Alexander know everything you know? Iris paused. Just long enough. Eleanor noticed. Know everything. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. What don't you know? Iris spoke quietly. The identity of the company that actually produced the chemicals responsible for the contamination. The garden air seemed colder now, because if that company were discovered, the fallout could reach across industries, across governments, across powerful families, and perhaps across the Whitmore empire itself. Eleanor Whitmore stood silent for several seconds. Then she said something unexpected. If you're going to investigate this family. Iris waited. Eleanor's voice was calm again. You should do it properly. Iris frowned slightly. What do you mean? Eleanor turned toward the house. Come inside. Her voice carried quiet authority. Iris followed her back toward the glowing terrace doors. But before they stepped inside, Eleanor added one more sentence. Because if someone used my family's companies to hide environmental crimes, her eyes hardened. Then I intend to find them before you do. And the way she said it made one thing suddenly clear. The quiet new wife might have walked into the Whitmore estate looking for answers, but she had just awakened something far more dangerous, Eleanor Whitmore's curiosity. And when Eleanor Whitmore began looking for the truth, people who had hidden secrets for years usually didn't survive the search. Dinner ended, but no one in the Whitmore estate believed the evening was truly over. The last plates were cleared, dessert had been served and politely tasted. Conversations resumed around the table, but they carried a strained politeness now, like musicians trying to continue playing after someone had snapped a violin string. Gregory Whitmore barely spoke another word. Victor Halden and two other executives had shifted the discussion to shipping contracts and global markets, pretending the earlier tension had simply been an intellectual debate. But the illusion fooled no one. Eleanor Whitmore sat silently at the head of the table, listening to everything and nothing at once. Her mind was moving through the conversation piece by piece. North Bay transport, chemical waste shipments, misclassified cargo, $2 billion settlements. And now her own brother's quiet panic, but something else bothered her even more. Iris Caldwell had known about Gregory's investment before she walked into the house, which meant she had researched the Whitmore family thoroughly. Carefully, the question was why. No curiosity, no caution. There had been purpose in the way she introduced that information, almost like someone placing a chess piece on a board, testing reactions. And Eleanor Whitmore had spent most of her life defeating people who played games like that, which meant she needed to understand exactly what game Iris Caldwell believed she was playing. Across the table, Alexander leaned slightly toward his wife. His voice was quiet. You've officially terrified half the people here. Iris smiled faintly. That wasn't my intention. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? Iris glanced toward Gregory at the far end of the table. He looked as though he had swallowed a stone. "Fear usually reveals things faster than politeness," she said softly. Alexander studied her. "You already knew he'd react that way." Iris did not answer, which was answer enough. At the head of the table, Eleanor placed her napkin beside her plate. A small motion, but one that immediately caught the attention of everyone present. "Dinner," she said calmly, "is finished." Chairs shifted as guests began rising. The Whitmore estate had quieted after the evening's tense dinner, but inside Eleanor Whitmore's mind, the storm had only begun. She led Iris through a private hallway, lined with ancestral portraits and polished oak panels. Their footsteps echoed softly, a slow, deliberate rhythm that mirrored the tension building inside Eleanor's chest. Once inside her study, Eleanor gestured toward a leather chair beside a massive mahogany desk. "Sit," she said. Her tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Iris obeyed immediately, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Eleanor circled the desk like a predator, scanning the room as though it held answers hidden in its walls. Then she stopped, hands clasped behind her back, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Do you know why I invited you to my home tonight?" Eleanor asked, breaking the silence. Iris looked up to understand what's real, she said. Eleanor allowed herself a faint smile, brave, precise, calm. Perfectly irritating, but useful. She stepped to a large wall of shelves and pulled a small velvet-covered drawer open. Inside were folders, Whitmore corporate records, investment reports, shipping manifests, and internal communications. Everything she had been reviewing late into the night. "I want you to see this," Eleanor said. She laid a folder carefully on the desk. The gold lettering read, "North Bay Transport, FIFID Hazardous Waste Shipments." Iris leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable, but her fingers flexed lightly against the desk. Eleanor tapped a section of the manifest. "Every shipment that passed through North Bay over the last 5 years is logged here, including the ones that escaped public scrutiny." Iris's eyes flicked over the pages with careful attention. Eleanor continued, "And that's just the surface. The real connections are deeper, suppliers who orchestrated these shipments to hide the source of contamination." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the air. "No, watch carefully." Eleanor opened a folder containing internal emails between North Bay executives and an external chemical supplier. Her finger traced a line of text, precise and cold. "This supplier is not only responsible for the misclassified shipments, they've been intentionally masking the origin of toxic runoff for years." And the most astonishing part, Eleanor looked directly at Iris, her gaze sharp. "They've been using the Whitmore family companies as their cover." Iris's lips parted slightly. Her composure remained intact, but a subtle tension ran through her shoulders. The gravity of Eleanor's revelation hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't speculation, it was documented, confirmed, executable. Eleanor continued. "And the supplier's identity is a surprise even to those who have been investigating from the outside." She slid a single piece of paper toward Iris. The name on it made the room's shadows seem to grow heavier. Iris stared at it for a long moment. Then her voice, calm yet trembling just slightly, whispered, "I didn't expect this." Eleanor studied her quietly. "I knew you wouldn't. That's why I wanted you here, to see the scale of what we're dealing with, to understand how deep the threads run." The tension between the two women was electric, charged with curiosity, caution, and a mutual recognition of power. Eleanor leaned closer. "This supplier has been operating under the radar for decades, manipulating logistics and contracts with precision that even seasoned executives struggle to detect. Their reach extends further than you imagine, not just in industry but across communities, politics, and investments." Iris's eyes narrowed, absorbing each word carefully. She knew this meant she was dealing with far more than environmental negligence. This was a web of influence, protection, and potential corruption. Threads she wasn't prepared to tug carelessly. Eleanor's voice softened just slightly. "I could handle this alone. But I want to know one thing." She fixed Iris with an unyielding stare. "Can you play this game with me?" Carefully, patiently, without letting anyone outside this room know exactly what we've discovered. Iris's response was measured. Yes, but we must move quickly. Ella nodded approvingly. Good. Because every moment the wrong people remain unaware, more damage accumulates, more communities suffer, and more lies are cemented into reality. For the first time that evening, the weight of the night's events settled fully in the room. The calm composure both women had maintained until now was no longer just courtesy. It was strategy, and outside the study, beyond the polished doors and ancestral portraits, the Whitmore empire continued to hum quietly with life. Employees unaware, executives unaware, relatives unaware, all moving through their routines as if nothing had changed. But Eleanor and Iris now held knowledge powerful enough to shake the foundation of it all. A subtle sound broke the silence, a faint click from the hallway. Both women stiffened. Eleanor's sharp instincts recognized it immediately. Someone was listening. She signaled to Iris, voice low and steady, "Stay calm, observe." Iris nodded, her breathing steady. Her hands rested lightly on the desk, ready but unassuming. Eleanor stepped toward the door, listening intently. Another soft click, footsteps retreating. Some unknown had been watching the study, but now they were gone. Eleanor returned to the desk, sliding the folder back toward Iris. "The real danger begins now," she said. Iris's eyes followed the papers, tracing the connections. "We need allies," she said softly. "People who understand the stakes and can move without triggering suspicion." Ella nodded. "I've already identified a few, but we must act carefully. The wrong move, and the supplier, whoever they are, will vanish before we can confront them." Iris's gaze flicked toward the window, dark shapes of trees swaying in the night breeze. "It won't be easy." Eleanor smiled faintly, a dangerous glint in her eyes. "Nothing worthwhile ever is." A long pause followed. The tension in the room was thick, filled with anticipation and silent calculations. Then Eleanor's voice cut through again, deliberate and precise. "We begin tomorrow." Iris nodded. Tomorrow, the first moves in a game that could decide the future of an empire, the fate of countless communities, and the trust of an entire family would be made. And both women knew, deep in their bones, that nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, the Whitmore estate was quiet, almost deceptively so. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Eleanor's private office, casting long gold-tinged shadows across the polished floors. Birds chirped faintly outside, oblivious to the storm brewing within the walls. Eleanor sat behind her mahogany desk, reviewing a digital display of internal Whitmore corporate networks. Lines of data, spreadsheets, and communication logs stretched across multiple screens. Her fingers moved with deliberate precision, tracing financial flows and shipments with an expertise that had been honed over decades. Iris stood beside her, a small notebook in hand, taking mental notes more than writing anything down. Her gaze flicked from screen to screen, absorbing patterns that could easily go unnoticed. "The first step," Eleanor said, "is identifying the supplier." Iris nodded. "We know they used North Bay Transport as a conduit." "No, we need to see where each shipment originated." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "And we need to know who authorized them internally. Every signature, every email chain, every misclassification note, it's all potentially relevant." Iris glanced at her. "That could point directly to someone within the Whitmore companies." "Exactly," Eleanor said, "and that's where discretion becomes essential. If anyone notices we're tracing these threads, the supplier will vanish." Iris leaned closer to the first screen. Shipment logs from 3 years ago. North Bay Transport had moved barrels marked as non-hazardous, but the actual content was highly toxic. The invoices listed generic chemical codes. "And there," she said, pointing at a name hidden in a chain of approvals, "James Calloway." Eleanor's lips pressed together. Calloway, Executive Director of Operations, trusted by everyone in the company. No one would suspect him. Iris raised an eyebrow. He could be the one covering the shipments, or he's just another link in a much larger chain. Eleanor nodded. "That's why we follow the trail carefully, step by step, until we reach the origin. She tapped the screen, and the internal emails appeared. Calloway had been in communication with an unlisted supplier account. Cryptic messages, vague shipping descriptions, and coded references to chemical batches. Iris's eyes flicked toward Eleanor. Someone with inside knowledge could manipulate all of this without raising alarms. And that someone could be dangerous if confronted. Eleanor leaned back. Dangerous is fine, as long as we're careful. They spent hours cross-referencing shipments, tracing accounts, and flagging irregularities. Every so often, Iris would pause. Eleanor would notice a subtle change in her expression. A flicker of surprise, a tightening of the jaw, a faint intake of breath. Something big was coming. Eleanor could feel it. Late morning, Iris stopped abruptly. "There it is," she said. "The trail ends in a small chemical processing company tucked away in an industrial district miles outside the city. The supplier is registered under a name that doesn't exist in public records. Shell company front for something larger." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "And you're certain of this connection?" Iris nodded. "Their shipments trace directly to North Bay, and internal communications indicate coordination. Someone high-level must be covering it." Eleanor's hand brushed her chin. "That means one of our executives is complicit, or someone with influence above them." The phone on Eleanor's desk buzzed softly. She glanced at it. Alexander. She picked it up. His voice was quiet, concerned. "Mother, I know you're investigating. Be careful." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Don't worry, I know how to move quietly." Alexander hesitated. "You know, Iris, she's capable, but even she might not anticipate what's coming next." Eleanor's eyes hardened. "That's why we move carefully. One wrong step and everything unravels." "Iris," she said, closing the folder on the desk. "Let's plan our next move." They plotted meticulously, deciding to follow the supplier's financial and shipping records without alerting anyone inside the company. Every step was deliberate, every contact carefully vetted. By early afternoon, Eleanor called in a few trusted long-term allies within the company, people who knew the internal systems but were unaware of the NA. Investigation without revealing the reason. Their task: discreetly access North Bay's authorization logs and trace the unknown supplier's connections. Hours later, a breakthrough. Iris's eyes widened as she scanned the files. One of the logs contained coded notes that suggested internal approval had been given, personally, by someone far higher than Calloway. Eleanor leaned over. The handwriting, it's subtle but familiar. Iris's voice dropped. "You're saying this person is in the inner circle of the Whitmore Empire?" Eleanor nodded. "And that's why discretion is critical. If they sense the investigation, they'll cover their tracks immediately." Iris's jaw tightened. "Then we're walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and the trail disappears." Eleanor allowed herself a small, controlled smile. "That's why I enjoy this work." As dusk approached, the tension remained thick in the study. Each piece of evidence uncovered brought them closer to the truth, and closer to danger. Eleanor stood, stretching slightly. "We're ready for the next step. But we must move at night. Shadows hide the most dangerous secrets, and the supplier is already skilled at disappearing." Iris nodded. "The first live operation begins tonight." Outside, the Whitmore estate gleamed quietly in the evening sun, oblivious to the silent storm preparing within its walls. And somewhere, hidden deep within the industrial district, the first domino of the supplier's empire was about to be disturbed. Night fell over the city like a velvet curtain, muting the streets and cloaking Eleanor and Iris in darkness. The Whitmore estate sat quietly behind them as they moved through narrow alleys toward the industrial district. The air was cool and heavy with the faint scent of chemicals from nearby factories. Every sound, the scrape of shoes on concrete, the distant hum of machinery, the flutter of a loose tarp, felt magnified in the tense silence between them. Eleanor adjusted her coat and glanced at Iris. "Are you ready for this?" Iris's eyes glinted in the dim light. "I've been ready since yesterday." They approached the edge of the supplier's facility. A chain-link fence topped with barbed wire ran along the perimeter. Security cameras rotated slowly, their red indicator lights blinking like watchful eyes. Eleanor crouched near the fence. motioning Iris to follow. The operation had been planned meticulously, but even the best planning could falter under human error or surprise. "We move fast," Eleanor whispered. "Stay calm. Observe first, act second." Iris nodded, her breathing steady. Together they skirted the shadows of the building, slipping past the camera's blind spots. The night was quiet, too quiet. Inside the facility, a single security light cast harsh yellow illumination over stacked crates and conveyor equipment. Eleanor motioned for Iris to stay low. There. A loading dock. Trucks come and go, but none have arrived tonight. Just one figure pacing near a stack of crates, a security guard probably checking the perimeter. Eleanor signaled. "We wait. Patience is part of the game." They crouched behind a stack of metal containers, observing. The guard's movements were methodical, predictable, almost mechanical. Yet Eleanor's instincts told her to remain cautious. Suddenly, a small noise, a metallic clang from inside the building, made them both freeze. The guard's head turned, alert. Iris held her breath. Eleanor's hand brushed hers, signaling silence. The guard stepped closer, and for a moment it seemed he might discover them. Then, as if sensing the shadows were empty, he returned to his path. Iris exhaled quietly. That was close. Eleanor nodded. Too close. But that's the risk we take. They slipped inside a side entrance that Eleanor had scouted from satellite images. The interior was dim, filled with the faint hum of refrigeration units and the pungent odor of chemicals. Stacks of drums marked hazardous materials lined the walls. Iris's eyes scanned quickly. Every label, every marking, every code, a map of activity hidden in plain sight. Eleanor moved toward a locked cabinet against the far wall. "This," she whispered, "is where they keep the shipment logs, manual backups of every transaction North Bay processes." Iris moved to cover the doorway, ears straining for any sound. The night had become a high-stakes game of silence, patience, and observation. Eleanor's fingers worked the lock swiftly. A soft click, and the cabinet opened. The folders inside smelled faintly of chemical residue and industrial dust. She pulled a folder labeled with the same coded supplier name from the logs. The handwriting was meticulous, almost obsessive. Eleanor ran her fingers over the entries. This is what connects everything." Iris leaned over her shoulder. "Every shipment, every barrel, every misclassified chemical, they've been moving materials intentionally. Someone on the inside is orchestrating it." Eleanor nodded. "And the pattern, it points directly to Calloway's chain of approvals. He's not the originator, just the middleman." Iris frowned. "The real player is higher up." A soft sound behind them. A door creak. Both women froze. Eleanor's hand rested on her coat pocket, where a small flashlight and a tablet were stashed. The door opened slowly, and a man stepped in. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but his posture was unmistakable. Internal security, familiar with the building's layout, alert, suspicious. Eleanor's mind raced. They have to appear ordinary, or we're compromised. The man paused near the cabinet. His flashlight beam swept the room, lingering briefly on the open folder. Iris's voice was barely a whisper. "Move slowly." Eleanor and Iris crouched behind the cabinet, just as the beam passed. The man muttered to himself, checking the logs, then moved toward a desk across the room. Every second felt eternal. Finally the man left the area, his footsteps fading down the hall. Eleanor exhaled softly. "Too close," she said. "That could have ended very badly." Iris's hands shook slightly, not with fear, but with adrenaline. Every move tonight carried enormous stakes. Eleanor closed the cabinet quietly, restoring the folders exactly as they had been. No one could suspect they'd been there. No, yet. "We have what we need," Eleanor said softly. "Enough to trace the supplier's operations further. But the true challenge," Iris knew, the hidden player behind all of this, the one manipulating shipments, approvals, and misclassifications, was still out there watching. Waiting, Ella nodded to the shadows. "We leave now, carefully, and we move to the next stage." Outside, the night had deepened. The city skyline glimmered faintly in the distance, oblivious to the danger creeping through its industrial veins. Iris looked at Eleanor. The supplier's network, it's massive. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Massive. Yes, but every network has its weak points. Every empire has a crack. We just need to find it. As they slipped back into the alley and retraced their steps toward the Whitmore estate, Eleanor's mind was already calculating. The supplier wouldn't stay hidden forever, and the person orchestrating all of this, they would make mistakes. Every empire leaves footprints. And tonight Eleanor and Iris had just found the first ones. The drive back to the Whitmore estate was silent. The city streets glimmered with wet reflections from a faint drizzle that had begun, misting over streetlights like soft veils. Eleanor kept her hands on the wheel, her mind already replaying every movement inside the supplier's facility. Iris sat beside her, notebook closed but eyes alert, scanning the shadows outside the car as if expecting the night itself to betray them. No one spoke. Words were unnecessary. The stakes were too high. When they reached the estate, the gates closed softly behind them. The lights inside glimmered like a quiet promise, oblivious to the secret operation that had just concluded. Eleanor led Iris to her study once again, where the mahogany desk awaited. She placed the acquired files carefully on the desk, lining them with the precision of someone who had spent decades handling secrets. "We need to trace every shipment back to the origin," Eleanor said. "That means untangling a web of fake company names, coded references, and false approvals." Iris nodded. "Every trail has a weak point. It's just a matter of finding it." They had barely begun when Eleanor's personal tablet buzzed quietly. A notification? No. An email? No. A call. A message sent through the estate's secure internal network. Eleanor frowned and opened it. Her eyes narrowed almost immediately. The message was simple, one line, no sender identified. "Stop digging. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Iris's head snapped up. "Someone inside the Whitmore network is already aware of us." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Whoever sent this is watching, and judging by the timing, they had access to real-time information about our investigation." Iris's voice was calm, but there was a tension beneath it. "That means someone is a mole." Eleanor tapped her fingers on the desk. "Or someone very close to the Empire is already connected to the supplier's operations." The implications hit both women at once. No, only were they uncovering a dangerous network, but the Whitmore inner circle itself might be compromised. Iris stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened gardens. Whoever sent this message isn't just monitoring the investigation, they're testing our reaction, measuring us. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "That's their mistake. Testing us won't intimidate us. No, no, ever." Iris turned slowly. "And yet, it's a dangerous game. Whoever this is knows the stakes. They could sabotage everything." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Then that's exactly why we move carefully. Step by step, trace the supplier, identify the insider, and neutralize both threats without raising suspicion." Iris's gaze fell on the files. "We begin with what we know, the shipments, the approvals, the coded messages. Whoever sent that warning has left traces." Eleanor nodded. "Every empire has weak points. Every network has cracks. And tonight we start identifying them." Outside the estate remained serene, guests asleep, servants unaware, the Whitmore Empire itself oblivious. But inside Eleanor's study, tension coiled like a living thing. Iris glanced at Eleanor. How many people could know about this? Eleanor's eyes glinted, fewer than 10. And of them, only one has the power to act without drawing attention. Iris's lips pressed into a thin line. That one person could destroy everything if we're not careful. Eleanor tapped the tablet again. "Whoever sent this message will act next, and when they do, we need to be ready." A faint hum of the estate systems filled the room. Shadows shifted across the walls as both women considered the reality. Someone inside their own circle might already be 2 steps ahead. Iris's voice broke the silence. "Then the investigation isn't just about the supplier anymore. It's about trust and betrayal." Eleanor's gaze sharpened. "Exactly, and betrayal inside a family empire is always deadly." She turned toward the files on the desk. "The night is far from over, and now every decision, every step, carries twice the risk." Outside, rain began to fall more heavily, striking the windows in soft, staccato taps. The sound was almost rhythmic, like a countdown, and in the quiet storm, both Eleanor and Iris understood the truth. The real danger wasn't just the supplier. It was someone in their midst, watching, waiting, ready to strike. The next morning, the Whitmore estate appeared serene, but beneath the surface, tension crackled like an unseen current. Eleanor sat in her study, eyes scanning the files and digital logs from the supplier operation the night before. Iris stood nearby, arms folded, analyzing the same data, her mind racing ahead, trying to anticipate every move of the hidden insider. Eleanor broke the silence first. "We know someone in the inner circle is aware of us. That much is certain. The question is, who?" Iris nodded, her gaze flicking toward the list of executives, board members, and department heads. Every signature, every authorization, every internal memo is a potential clue. "We start with behavior," she said. "Patterns. What's normal, what's abnormal, and what's deliberately misleading." Eleanor tapped a finger against the desk. "Let's begin with James Calloway. He handled North Bay approvals, but he's unlikely to be the mastermind. Still, he's the first anomaly." Iris opened his file, his schedules, his communications, his movements over the past 2 years. On the surface, everything looks routine: late nights, standard approvals, polite memos, but Eleanor spotted the irregularity immediately, a recurring code embedded in seemingly harmless financial notes, a small flourish in his digital signatures. She said quietly, "Almost imperceptible." Iris leaned closer. "Could it be accidental?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, with someone this careful." "No, in a network like this, that's deliberate?" Iris exhaled. "Then Calloway is either an accomplice or a decoy. Either way, he's important." They spent the next hours reviewing every internal line of communication. Subtle patterns began to emerge in encrypted language, timestamps, coded references to shipments, approvals, and hidden contacts. And then they noticed something else. One of the board executives, Henry Langford, had been unusually attentive during Eleanor's private meetings with department heads. Iris frowned. "That's subtle. He's not part of the logistics chain, yet he monitors everything like a hawk." Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "And that makes him the perfect insider. Observes, reports, but doesn't touch the operation yet." A faint notification blinked on Eleanor's tablet. Another message, short, almost cryptic. "Step carefully. No, all shadows are empty." Iris's jaw tightened. That's their warning, or a test. Whoever is sending these knows exactly how close we are. Eleanor's gaze flicked to Langford's recent communications. He had requested updates on North Bay activity routine on the surface, but the frequency and timing were abnormal. Iris's voice dropped. "If he's monitoring us, he could sabotage our investigation at any moment." Eleanor nodded slowly. "That's why we proceed cautiously. Observe, collect evidence, expose nothing until we're certain." Hours passed, with both women poring over every internal system, every email, every shipment log. Each new piece of data brought them closer to understanding the supplier network, but also closer to someone who might strike if they realized the investigation was advancing too fast. Late afternoon, Eleanor stood and walked to the window, gazing across the estate's gardens. Her mind was racing through contingencies. They had uncovered the first signs of the insider, but revealing it prematurely could alert him. Iris followed. "You're thinking he'll act soon." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "More than act, he'll test us. Push boundaries, see how much we know without revealing himself." Iris's eyes narrowed. "That means the next move is critical. One wrong step, and our cover is blown." Eleanor turned sharply, voice calm but firm. "Then we set the stage, we manipulate the perception, make him think he's in control while we tighten the net." Iris's fingers flexed. "That's risky." Eleanor smiled faintly. "All of this is risky. That's why it's exhilarating." They returned to the study, running simulations of internal communications and potential leaks, identifying exactly how the insider could be exposed without creating suspicion. Every angle was considered: surveillance, digital forensics, behavioral analysis, cross-referencing schedules. By evening, they had a plan. They would plant controlled information breadcrumbs that the insider could detect, watch his reactions, track him without alerting him to their awareness. Iris looked at Eleanor. If he's as careful as we think, he might suspect a trap. Eleanor's eyes glinted. Then we make him believe it's accidental. Imperfect data, just enough to pique curiosity, but not enough to confirm suspicion. Night fell again over the Whitmore estate. Lanterns glimmered along the garden paths, casting long shadows that mirrored the tension inside. The investigation had moved from discovery to strategy, and somewhere within the walls of the Empire, Henry Langford, or whoever the insider truly was watching, calculating, waiting. Eleanor and Iris understood one truth clearly. In a game of power, secrecy, and betrayal, the smallest misstep could unravel everything. The first trap had been set. The game of shadows had begun. Night had fully fallen over the Whitmore estate, draping the gardens and terraces in a blanket of shadows. Inside Eleanor's study, the air was tense, almost electric, as she and Iris executed the first phase of their plan, the controlled leak of information. Breadcrumbs carefully curated to appear accidental had been inserted into the internal network earlier that afternoon. No, they waited. Iris stood near the window, her eyes scanning the darkened gardens. Though the danger was digital rather than physical, Eleanor remained at her desk, fingers poised over the tablet. "Any minute," she said, "the insider will respond." Iris exhaled softly. "He'll know something's off, but he won't know we know." "That's the critical part." Eleanor nodded. "Exactly. This is a delicate balance. Too much exposure, and the game ends. Too little, and we miss the chance to observe his reaction." A soft chime echoed from Eleanor's tablet. The first sign. Someone had accessed the planted files. Eleanor's pulse quickened. "He's curious," she whispered, watching, testing. Iris leaned over, eyes narrowing at the tablet screen. The log shows activity across multiple departments. He's tracing the trail, checking approvals, reviewing shipment codes. Eleanor's lips pressed together, and that means he's cautious, but confident he hasn't been detected. Then a second chime, more files accessed. The insider is moving faster than anticipated. Iris's voice dropped. If he discovers the pattern too quickly, it could compromise everything. Eleanor's gaze hardened. Then we prepare for confrontation, mentally, strategically. The moment he pushes further, we need to respond instantly, but without revealing our hand. Minutes passed. Every notification on the tablet made the room feel smaller, tighter. The sound of rain tapping against the windows outside matched the rhythm of their rising tension. Then, soft footsteps in the hallway outside the study. Eleanor froze. Iris's hand brushed lightly against hers. "No, a coincidence," Eleanor whispered. The door handle moved. A shadow appeared in the doorway. Henry Langford. He stepped inside, expression calm, almost casual, but Eleanor and Iris could feel the subtle tension in every line of his posture. "Evening," he said smoothly. "Thought I'd check on some of these files." Eleanor's eyes didn't waver. "And you are?" He smiled faintly, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "I was concerned about operational efficiency. Some irregularities noticed earlier." Iris tilted her head slightly. Curiosity, observation, challenge. He's probing, testing boundaries. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, fingers resting lightly on the tablet. "We're reviewing all recent North Bay shipments. Efficiency is critical." Henry's gaze flicked toward the screen, a subtle tightening of his jaw. He's seen the planted files. Iris's voice was low, almost conversational. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding in the logs. Minor discrepancies, nothing serious." Henry's eyes narrowed subtly. "You think I'd believe that?" Eleanor's tone remained calm. "Nothing to believe," she said. "Just facts. We're ensuring compliance and accuracy." The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Rain tapped against the windows, punctuating the tension. Henry lingered near the desk, clearly scanning the room, the devices, the files. Then he leaned slightly closer, voice soft but deliberate. "You're being very careful, too careful." Eleanor's eyes locked onto his. That's because we understand what's at stake. Henry smirked faintly, perhaps. But I always notice the smallest inconsistencies. They tell more than the documents ever could. Iris stepped slightly closer to Eleanor. Their presence together was deliberate, subtle, quiet, but unmistakable, a silent warning. Eleanor's voice remained steady, controlled. Then perhaps we should review these inconsistencies together, clarify them. Henry paused, eyes flicking to the folder in the center of the desk. His lips pressed into a thin line. A test, he realized, perhaps too late. Iris smiled faintly. Don't worry. Nothing here will surprise you. Henry's expression hardened subtly, though he masked it with civility. He left the room with a nod that was anything but friendly, footsteps echoing down the hall. As the door clicked softly behind him, Eleanor exhaled slowly. That was close. Iris leaned against the desk, voice calm but low. He's suspicious, more than we anticipated. Eleanor's gaze returned to the tablet. Yes, and now we know how carefully we have to proceed. Every step, every observation, every reaction must be accounted for. The real danger is no longer just the supplier or the hidden operations. It's the insider within their empire. Someone who already knows they're being watched. Someone who could strike at any moment. Iris glanced at Eleanor, determination in her eyes. Then we double our precautions. Watch him control the information flow and be ready for whatever comes next. Eleanor nodded. The game has changed. It's no longer just discovery, it's survival. And outside, the night continued, oblivious to the silent war being waged within the walls of the Whitmore Empire. The following nights blurred into a tense rhythm of surveillance, planning, and careful maneuvering. Eleanor and Iris monitored Henry Langford with precision, noting every subtle move, every unusual communication, and every coded instruction he issued within the company. Every step they took was calculated to stay invisible while gathering evidence, and every small success brought them closer to unraveling both the supplier network and the insider threat. One evening, Eleanor's tablet pinged. Langford had ordered a minor shipment rerouted without official authorization. It was a small act, but enough to reveal his hand. Eleanor and Iris knew the time for subtlety was ending. They traced the shipment back to a hidden warehouse, coordinated with a trusted ally outside the empire, and prepared a confrontation that would expose both Langford and the supplier simultaneously. At the warehouse, the evidence was undeniable. Documents, shipment logs, and financial records proved that Langford had been covering for the supplier, facilitating misclassified chemical shipments, and manipulating the Whitmore internal approvals to protect the operation. Eleanor and Iris watched from the shadows as authorities moved in, carefully orchestrated to ensure Langford's arrest and the supplier's shutdown without endangering the empire's reputation. Back at the Whitmore estate, the tension dissolved into a fragile calm. Eleanor and Iris reviewed the final reports together. The web of deception had been untangled, the insider exposed and the supplier neutralized. Communities at risk would now be safeguarded. And the Whitmore family, though shaken, remained intact. Alexander appeared, quietly placing a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "You've done what I thought impossible." Eleanor smiled faintly, eyes reflecting exhaustion and satisfaction. "Sometimes the quietest moves leave the deepest impact," Iris nodded, "and sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who hold the power to change everything." For a moment they stood in silence. The weight of danger lifted, but the memory of the tension lingering like a shadow. The night outside was calm now. Lanterns glimmered along the gardens, rain had ceased, and the Whitmore estate looked serene. But Eleanor and Iris knew one truth: power, secrecy, and betrayal were always nearby, waiting for the next quiet moment to test even the strongest alliances. And yet they had survived, they had prevailed. And in the aftermath they realized that courage, careful observation, and unyielding determination could rewrite even the most dangerous of stories. The Whitmore Empire had faced its shadow and emerged intact, but forever changed by the quiet strength of two women who refused to back down. And so the night ended, but the echoes of courage, strategy, and quiet strength lingered long after the Whitmore empire had faced its shadows. Two women, calm yet unyielding, had unraveled webs of deception, exposed secrets hidden in plain sight, and shown that bravery isn't always loud. It can be deliberate, precise, and fearless. In the heart of power, where trust and betrayal walk hand in hand, they proved one truth: even in the darkest moments, a calm mind and a determined heart can change everything. They moved quietly, but their impact will be remembered forever. And to you, my dear viewers, remember this: every empire has its secrets, every family has its shadows, and every choice carries weight. But it's courage, wisdom, and the willingness to act that make the impossible possible. This story, like so many I share, is not just a tale of intrigue. It's a reflection of life's lessons, of human resilience, and of the power we each hold when we refuse to back down. From the quiet moves to the bold confrontations, the triumphs and the tests, I'm here to bring you these stories that stir your heart, challenge your mind, and keep you on the edge of your seat. I am Mr. David Lovestories, and thank you for joining me tonight. Remember, the world is full of secrets, and sometimes the quietest voices have the loudest impact.